Hi, everybody, and welcome. My name is Andrew Nakazawa, and I'm the manager of placemaking and public spaces with the Downtown Vancouver Business Improvement Association. It is my pleasure to host this week's Members Helping Members webinar that focuses on the future of placemaking and public spaces in a COVID-19 world with our guest presenter, Derek Lee of PWL Partnership. So thanks everybody for tuning in. Before we jump into the content, if you do have any questions, you can submit them as we go through the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window. So you can put them in there. Derek will be answering the submitted questions after the presentation, but feel free to submit your questions as we go. Let's get into the programming. Today's topic is presented by Derek Lee, as I said, from PWL Partnership. Derek is a principal at PWL Partnership and a LEED accredited landscape architect with over 20 years of experience across North America, Asia, the United Kingdom, and the Middle East. Serving as the creative lead on design teams at PWL, Derek focuses on innovative placemaking and urban design with a view to improve people's overall health and quality of life. His work ranges from large-scale urban planning and streetscape revitalizations to urban waterfront developments and custom details that celebrate a site's unique character. And with that, I'll hand it over to Derek to get started. So Derek, the Zoom floor is all yours.
All right, well, thank you very much, Andrew. And thank you all for being here today. Hopefully this is going to be a very interesting dialogue. And I really want to emphasize this as being a dialogue because I think we are all entering into a bit of an unknown in terms of how our current situation with COVID-19 is impacting cities around the world and really trying to navigate our own path in terms of how we can utilize this crisis as sort of a catalyst for change and a catalyst for really taking our public spaces and looking at how they can really help improve social and economic vibrance in our downtown. I wanted to show this slide because I think it does point to how our society worldwide has changed. And it's actually quite incredible to look back over the last 3 or 4 months to see how human behavior has sort of embraced this new normal. The idea that we socially distance ourselves nearly automatically when we pass each other on the streets or when we're sitting in a park. And I don't know if this is really going to be snapping back to the way we were so quickly. We're seeing that the pandemic may be here to stay longer than expected. A vaccine is it's not so clear when that's going to happen. And I think that given these sort of extended timelines, we really do need to embrace this opportunity to rethink our public spaces in our cities. So one of the things that we've seen over the last several months, and this was obviously a month or two ago, is how this pandemic has really affected businesses in our downtown. And I think this is really appropriate given the fact that most of you in the audience are owners of businesses or represent the interests of businesses downtown, and how this crisis has really had a profound impact, not only on the businesses, but the urban fabric itself. And as businesses begin to open their doors once again, as they have over the last several weeks, one of the big challenges for most businesses is how do we maintain social distancing? How do we reconcile the fact that we're only allowed a fraction of the occupancy on the interiors of within our businesses? And what does that mean for really embracing the exterior environment, the sidewalks, the streets, the public realm, to really allow businesses to thrive? And not just the businesses, but when you look around the world about how businesses kind of spill out into public space, it does create a much more vibrant condition. And so streets, are they really just for cars and sidewalks for people to move, or can they be re-envisioned as outdoor living rooms for the city? So I thought I'd show this graphic because it really does show the economic impact. This is worldwide. This is from Oxford Economics about the projected impact on tourism industry revenue. And when we think about our downtowns, a major component of the people that we can see on the street and in shops and in restaurants, a large component of that is tourism. You get the pulses from cruise ships. You have people coming in from all over the world, staying in hotels. And we really see that even moving into the next several months, we're still going to be down significantly. The projections are minus 35% worldwide, and something needs to fill that gap. So if it's not tourists, it's more citizens of our city who need to start frequenting our businesses and inevitably sort of occupy the public realm. This was also quite interesting as well in terms of how more households plan to decrease spending as opposed to increase spending. And it's quite interesting. I guess maybe this is our sense of conservatism in Canada, but we seem to be less optimistic about what may be happening. And as a result, we seem to be on the lower end in terms of what we plan to spend as households. And so, again, this has a profound effect in terms of the retail presence in downtowns and hotels and so forth. And how do we rethink our urban fabric to address that? So as mentioned before, our behaviors are absolutely changing. We're in phase 3 right now, where we are able to be in groups of 6 or less. We eventually will be entering into phase 4, although again, come September, we may be slipping back into phase 3 or phase 2, or even possibly phase 1, depending on what happens. And so this is here to stay. But one thing that we have noticed is that while we've seen a decrease in patrons of businesses, we've seen a huge spike over this last 3 or 4 months of how people use public spaces, and especially parks. And for any of you who've been to any patch of grass anywhere in the city, I mean, it feels like Kitts Beach in the middle of July. And, I think this is a real visible shift in terms of our culture. And it's actually quite desirable, to be out there. I mean, it's sort of, we're a bit of a herd species, and I think we enjoy the company of other people, needless to say, at a distance. So how do we take this construct and begin to apply it in the downtown context? So there's a few things that we wanted to look at in terms of what can stimulate businesses and improve social vibrance. And there's a number of tools in our toolkit that we have been successful with in terms of rethinking our public spaces. And I'll just go through some pretty high level stuff to begin with here. As landscape architects and urban designers, we've learned that taking an approach to what we like to call tactical urbanism, or quick start projects that allow for experimentation, I think this gives people this sense of confidence, particularly stakeholders who may fear change, who may fear, for example, the loss of cars as being negative to business. But it also allows testing. This is the 800 block of Robson during the Redux, which is since council has deemed as a pedestrian street, but it did prove the viability of, by transforming and pedestrianizing a section of street, it actually creates more foot traffic than less. And we see that all over the world. The other opportunity is the activation of privately owned public spaces, of which there are many in downtown Vancouver, whether it's the plaza spaces in front of banks, or in this case, the Wall Center, where this was actually, when the Wall Center was developed, this was dedicated public space, publicly accessible space. But the challenge for many is that they don't feel like public spaces, especially if there's a security guard surveilling it or what have you. But when we did the Land Summit back in 2014, for about $5,000, we decided, you know what, we're going to transform a space like this, and we'll get into that in a bit. But I think we're beginning to see more of these developers or business owners transforming these public spaces. Long-term transformation of public spaces, I think, could be much more profound, and we'll also get into that in our presentation. This is one of my favorite places in the world, which is La Rambla in Barcelona, which is really turning a street on its head, and really focusing on the pedestrians with vehicles still there, as part of a shared street, but they're along the margins. So it's a bit counterintuitive in our North American culture to be able to envision public space this way. but it's absolutely possible. And La Rambla is one of the highest grossing streets on the planet for that very reason. So streets for pandemic response and recovery. There's been a lot of thinking as of late by, planning agencies, cities, municipalities around the world. And very quickly, we're beginning to put together a bit of a toolkit of these responses, call them quick starts, or ways to be able to respond to people's shifting behaviors. And we see this all over the world, how cities are rethinking their public spaces, from bike lanes to car-free cores. We are all preparing for recovery and a post-COVID future. We're seeing this in the US, we're seeing this in Europe. Whether it's Lithuania, who's announcing plans to open 18 streets for dining al fresco, or Tel Aviv, Chicago, and Barcelona, who are pedestrianizing their streets for the same reason. Many cities are actually suspending or limiting licensing restrictions on outdoor dining as well. So there's a policy piece here, which I think the city is working hard to do, and they've actually turned around some of the shortest time frame kind of permits to allow outdoor dining to happen in our city. Licensing is another issue, and Vancouver is still working on that. And you can see the list going on and on in terms of just the sheer lengths of street in cities around the world that are being repurposed as slow streets or bike lanes, or replacing cars with other pedestrian focused spaces. NACTOS, which is what is it? The National Association of Transportation Authority in the US, they've actually put a handbook out. They've had a whole volume of handbooks in terms of how to address or how to design streets. And they've most recently put out a handbook or a paper on how we can begin to respond and reclaim aspects of streets that have seen maybe reduced traffic volumes, and how to repurpose the streets for sidewalk extensions, safe crossings for pedestrians. Also looking at slow streets, which is something that the city of Vancouver has now implemented across the city, from, I believe it's King Edward to Clark Drive and beyond, where you have smaller streets winding through neighborhoods that allow people to socially distance, and possibly even use to walk down the centers of the streets, so they become shared as opposed to divided streets for different types of movement. And streets as outdoor rooms, right? Open and play streets as sort of the outdoor living rooms that certainly provide greater space, especially for people, and I can't emphasize this enough, in our city, in the downtown, who live in small apartments and small condos that really need a lot of space to stretch out. And there's more and more families living in these spaces. And so how, again, can we repurpose our streets, our laneways, our plazas, our corridors to really meet the demands of not just one segment of the population, but sort of around the clock, all demographics. And again, outdoor dining, which I think there's a lot of opportunity, and we're now beginning to see it being contemplated by the DVBIA on Granville Street in terms of extending those streets out. Outdoor market spaces, and this is looking at temporary street closures and really trying to build that sense of commerce. And one of the things that we've seen a lot of, whether it's on Alberni Street or Robson Street or Granville Street or other shopping streets, is that whether it was induced by COVID-19 or not, there's a lot of for lease signs on buildings and retail units. And oftentimes that doesn't help sort of that continuity of pedestrian traffic, especially on a retail street. And so the idea of outdoor markets or kiosks or food trucks or those types of things that actually begin to allow that foot traffic to move along the street and extend that walkability of the street with interesting, what we like to call urban breadcrumbs along the way, can really help a street economically. In terms of local initiatives, I think there are a few great examples of what we've done. And one of the things that we've been doing for the Vancouver Public Space Network is we did a series of visualizations of what existing conditions of streets would be now, and essentially the measures of what could happen, you know, in a first stage where we're really beginning to kind of address the COVID-19 situation and that immediate desire for people to need to socially distance, allowing space to pass on sidewalks and so forth, queuing for transit, and creating that safe environment and leveraging reduced traffic volumes to push that parking out. We're beginning to see this on in other municipalities now too. But in the next stages, you know, how do we begin to sort of evolve that idea more meaningfully, whether it's downtown on a high street or a neighborhood, where we begin to sort of evolve that into sort of more permanent interventions over time. You know, Pavement to Plazas is a city Vancouver initiative, and there's great examples along Denman Street and along Main Street where, you know, it really started with some modest interventions, which again could be induced by the situation that we're in right now, but certainly lead to more kind of permanent effects of really leveraging that shift in habits that's kind of stayed with the population over several months in terms of spending less time in a car and more time on foot or on bikes and being outside. You know, this was a little bit more of an ambitious one of looking at Water Street, which, you know, there's been a lot of discussion around, should we pedestrianize Water Street, you know, and it could start again with really recognizing that a 40 or 60 foot wide streetscape, you know, without cars it can be quite empty. But just like you see in the central core of shopping malls, interior shopping malls, you'll usually see kiosks down the center of the mall. This is kind of a universal kind of dimension where you can have seating, nodes of activity. And, you know, as that begins to gain traction, you know, you can begin to think about that in a more permanent way. Here are some examples of what we're now beginning to see implemented. This is Davie Street in the West End, one of the largest parklets around, at least in our city. And the city of North Vancouver's repurposed 12 kilometers of roads for pedestrians and patios. And interestingly enough, they've literally put pylons up and down Lonsdale, from the foot of Lonsdale all the way to 23rd Street, I think. Doesn't matter what the commercial retail business, but there is everything from, you know, AstroTurf to logs to movable chairs. It's hilarious, but it's definitely something that people are beginning to take notice of and to be using a bit more. We're seeing the slow traffic, the slow streets that are being implemented. Again, here's the AstroTurf on Lonsdale. And again, these are kind of rough and ready. I mean, they're really sort of crude interventions, but I do think they allow people to rethink how public space can be used. This is one in my neighborhood, which is on the corner of 18th and Canby Street in Canby Street Village, right in front of the JJ Bean. You know, and the hope is that these could, I guess, if seen as successful, eventually evolve into something more permanent, which is in some ways what we've been kind of exploring with the DVBIA right now for Granville Street, in terms of leveraging the City of Vancouver's designation of as for the parking areas as loading zones, but loading zones is probably more of a flexible term for other things such as food trucks and outdoor seating and such that could spread out. So again, modest interventions. I mean, this is not something new. This is something that cities and municipalities are doing all over the place right now. So the thing is, really, how can we make these spaces not only more permanent, but more appealing? And, you know, I think that we're also doing stuff locally that we can fall back on that really speak to more thoughtful design. And I think design, the right materials, the right color, beginning to think about, you know, a brand for the particular street or precinct, I think, become important. And there's a sort of a level of sophistication to it, but it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be prohibitive in terms of cost at all. Again, the Urban Fabric Park that we did in 2014 here was about $5,000 with some sweat equity. And we went to Surrey and bought that stretchy sari fabric, which clings to trees like shrink wrap. And we bought these Dairyland gave us those plastic milk crates that we basically wrapped and put a piece of foam on the top, and they became cubes that were strewn across the lawn. And literally overnight, I mean, people started flooding into this space. There was a huge sense of curiosity and joy with what we had been able to create. We talked about the 800 block of Robson Street, which now has become more permanent. But what was really cool about it was it became kind of a bit of an urban lab where every month there was a new kind of installation there, different types of seating. And again, we need to sort of treat our city as a bit of a laboratory to experiment with different ideas. And what better place to do it than in the public realm? We as a firm have been heavily involved in small spaces. The Chocolatory Parklet here on Main Street is one example. Other examples that were not ours, but certainly are popping up all over the place are these parklets along Robson Street, Main Street, any neighborhood sort of high street, you're beginning to see this. And this is kind of a new normal. And I think it's a testament to our shifting mobility patterns and really provoking thought about how we reuse that cross section of the street, not just for vehicles, but for other purposes. As a firm, we were quite involved in the redesign, the renovation of Granville Street back in 2008, 2009. At that time, it was on the heels of the Olympics. And I think going back to the Olympics, I think it was a real special time where there was a huge investment by the business community, by the city, and VANOC, of course, and doing a lot of things that would normally be done, such as artful interventions, like these wonderful lantern trees that sort of signified, people from around the world. But what it did was it really created this amazing space, and people would, you wouldn't even recognize the street with this in it, and versus it being a transit corridor. And again, I don't think it takes much, but it really takes partnerships and the initiatives of business owners, the DVBIA, the city, and so forth. Pavement to plazas is another great initiative in our city, where in a lot of the side streets that front onto main streets are pedestrianized. And we've seen a lot of these great examples where a bit of paint on street surfacing and custom furniture, or, a modest sort of public art intervention or music or programming can really help activate these spaces and shift people's perception of things. And the other thing that I think we've been dabbling in as well is how do we activate our lanes? We have a lot of lanes in the urban fabric of downtown, and I think the general feeling is, well, they're reserved for garbage and recycling and their utility, but they are absolutely ripe for change. And I think when you see a lot of the initiatives that have happened over the last few years, I think it's really the first coat of paint, literally, and layered on top of that are some soft programming initiatives. But beyond that, when you look at some examples of around the world, where businesses are using laneways as viable frontages, and we see it a bit with Salt off of Water Street and some other businesses. But I think there's a real opportunity to make this sort of this parallel experience of being in the downtown that could be vastly different than just simply being on a street. And so what we can learn from other places is important. I think it's important to understand what we do as a city and some of our past successes, but what are some of the longer term, more permanent successes that cities have? So we've talked about COVID, we've talked about sort of interim solutions, but what is it that we should aspire to, potentially with some longer term solutions as people's habits begin to change? So this is Cartier's Spectacles in Montreal. And if anyone's been there, it's such an interesting corridor because it's programmed all year round. This was created in 2003, and it was a non-for-profit organization that brought together about 85 members who were active in its territory. The board was comprised of cultural, institutional, educational, and business sectors, as well as the city of Montreal and local residents. And it was an ambitious mission to really enrich the city's cultural assets, really to create vibrant programming throughout the year. And you look at the winter, and they, if they can do it, we certainly can as well, especially if it's -40 and people are still out enjoying wonderful cultural activities outside. So I think that's really a point of inspiration for perhaps what we could do with some of our streets in our urban core. St. Catherine Street as well is a great example in Montreal, where we do a lot of street closures in our city, but they've taken it to the next level. They've leveled up in terms of really creating a very strong brand and theme to the street that, it is closed from July 12th to July 14th. So not a very long time for pedestrians, but I mean, the amount of investment that they've put into making the street incredible to experience during that time. And presumably this stuff stays when it's back to normal, but it creates quite a powerful vision for the street. And when you look at this, you think, this is probably not a tremendous budget either, and very doable. Back to laneways. I mean, one of the favorite, you can go to any centuries old city around the world, and there's just great examples of laneways. But, there's a lot of comparisons drawn between Vancouver and Mebourne in terms of the size of the city, kind of the general culture, to some degree, the climate. And, they've had a long history of activating laneways. These little streets, as they were called, were used as carriage lanes during the Victorian era, but it really wasn't until the 1990s that the city began to gentrify the laneways that were pleasingly intimate in scale, tucked away from the busier streets, and became famous for their street art. And now they're highly popular locations for shops, restaurants, bars, and of course, tourists and residents. Another one that's interesting is this is actually a precedent that we tend to use in our urban design work a lot, is Santana Row in San Jose. And if you don't know this project, it's actually kind of an outdoor shopping center, but what they've done is it sort of derives its name from Mark Santana, who served on San Jose's planning commission in the 1950s. And really, it's a village within a city that takes the proportions of typical streets and has basically re-envisioned them, if you will. So this is a fully functional street with cars that can move up and down one side. There's a boulevard in the middle, and then it repeats on the other side. But it just goes to show the idea of what alfresco culture looks like, where it really literally comes straight out to the curb, and essentially there's a sidewalk in between the actual building and the alfresco patios. They've gotten around their liquor licensing and so forth, but it does create a very desirable street. And within the center median of the street, and again, you're looking at probably about an 80 to 100 foot wide street wall. So this is not atypical to what a typical street would be here in Vancouver. But it just goes to show how we can think about repurposing the middles of streets as outdoor living rooms, as places for people, and possibly even layering into that additional retail as well. La Rambla in Barcelona, as mentioned before, it's probably one of the highest grossing streets anywhere. And what's really interesting about this is that all the kitchens are in the buildings, and you have waiters that are literally crossing the streets to serve patrons in the middle of the street. So There's no excuse for a street necessarily to get in the way, a traffic street to get in the way of being able to activate patios. And I think it's really that sense of body heat and that more intimate scale that these more movable interventions really create. And beautiful tree canopies. And that's one thing that we really benefit from in Vancouver, is if we are able to invest in trees and planted the right way, that they have huge ability to create a wonderful microclimate, that biophilic effect, and just a wonderful people place. When I was there with my family last summer, we also visited the Superblocks of Barcelona, and these are large areas. If you know Barcelona, there's sort of a large grid of blocks, and every intersection, these were all designed in Roman times, were sort of these large kind of plaza-like intersections that, you know, in the last 50 or 60 years have been basically highly traffic focused intersections. And so the woman mayor of Barcelona a couple of years ago had basically said, nope, we're going to transform these, and thoughtfully designed planters, you know, artfully designed, very simple furniture, play areas, things that sort of play into kind of a general look and feel and a sense of civic pride, rather than just Jersey barriers and, you know, brightly like utility barriers and things like that. So again, these are all within reach without a huge amount of investment. So imagine this, and I put this on LinkedIn a few weeks ago, and it's more of a provocation, but I wanted to show you what some of the streets might look like that we've always assumed to be, you know, streets in their own right. And let me just go to the video here. And I wanted to play this for you. Imagine a street that's not a street that we think it is now. So the idea of, you know, really extending that al fresco patio culture out into the street, you know, lots of space for pedestrian movement alongside buildings or down the center of streets. And what's also interesting is when we're looking at the loop, it's the Beach Avenue Davie Street one-way loop that's happened. It's a different way of thinking about traffic flow, but it still has rendered Davie Street a viable street, especially replacing a lot of the parking with parklets and things like that. So this is Robson Street. Why could we not do this? And I'm hoping this is a bit of a provocation for conversation. Similarly, if I go back to here, this is a serious provocation because, whoops, let me just go back to this. Sorry, guys. This is a street that many would consider heresy if we took traffic off of it. But why not? Let's imagine what that could look like. And, you know, our mobility patterns are changing into the future. Why is this impossible to conceive of? Similarly, you know, if we were to look at Granville Street, this is a section between Robson and Smythe. The Orpheum Theatre is on the right-hand side. Right now, it's a transit corridor, but when we designed the street in 2008 and 2009, there was long-term thinking that the diversions for transit would be put in place. So along, I believe it's Seymour Street to the north, and I believe it's Howe Street or Hornby to the west. Sorry, on each side, left and right. That has allowed the street to be closed during evenings and weekends. But how can we level this up? And imagine this street as something that is a bit more permanent. You could imagine the trees becoming much more mature and sort of the central walkway, and allowing kind of the businesses to spill out into the street. And there you have it, sort of a pedestrian street that could happen in the foreseeable future. So those are really, I think, some provocations, if you will, that might ask us to view our streets differently. And just going back into full screen mode here. So really, in the midst of every crisis lies great opportunity. And can we dare to be bold? Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Derek. I really appreciate that. Lots of great insight and great imagery there. So fantastic presentation. So now we'll move into the Q&A portion. So a reminder to please submit your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen if you haven't done so already. We've got a couple to start with here. So we'll go right into that. This first one submitted by Stella. It's actually probably more a question that I could field and I could take offline and connect with Stella afterwards, but I'll still read it out here. Where did it go? Sorry, one second. What is the future availability of public space activations going forward? Will the DVBIA and the City of Vancouver work with nonprofits who are interested in booking public space activations? How might nonprofits get access to what public spaces might be available? So short answer to that is yes. So we're not the keepers of what happens in public spaces, but we're definitely ones that work with the city already to try and get things happening in terms of activations. And we do already work with a lot of nonprofits and other groups and organizations all across the city. So we'd be happy to get in touch with you to talk more on how we could partner or help you get activations in public spaces. But that's definitely something that we can connect with afterwards, Stella. Derek, did you have any piece to add to that? Or
no, I think that's good. I think that there's definitely partnerships involved in some of these initiatives too. So I think it's partly the DVBIA. I think it's also partnering with other initiatives as well, like the city, the Vancouver Public Space Network, and all the stakeholders. So I think that's really why we all need to come together as a community to really develop a common vision. What are our common priorities, and where do we really want to make these investments?
Absolutely. Great. Perfect. Second one coming in here was, how can the temporary patios morph into more permanent ones and be year-round? Rain cover, question mark.
Yes. I think rain cover is an excellent suggestion in our city. And I think that what we've seen from some of the examples around the world are that by no means do we need to have permanent structures to create that sense of permanency. Like if you look at Las Ramblas in Barcelona or some other examples, lots of covered canopies. I think what's permanent about a lot of those places are that those areas programmatically have been designated, right? And so we don't necessarily need heavy steel infrastructure with big glass canopies to manage weather protection. I think it's interventions that we've been using for centuries.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're seeing a lot of that in terms of the temporary changes that are happening because of COVID. A lot of people are seeing that, like, COVID aside, these are some great changes that are happening that maybe should be permanent, and why haven't we done this all along? So I think it's great to see that mindset shift. Next one here. Are you hearing or seeing the idea of these laneway transformations or pavement to plazas gaining more traction to do more of them?
No question. I think that the city is definitely building momentum in this area for sure. And I think that I think the first few were a bit questionable in terms of building people's confidence that they would be successful, but I think they've proven themselves out. And now the city, in their pavement to plazas initiative, their parklets initiative, and their laneways initiatives are beginning to sort of expand this out. And I think they're really, at this point, I would kind of classify them as semi-permanent. But the hope is, again, when you look at cities like Mebourne or that now they've kind of sowed the seeds for retailers to really occupy more and more of these laneways. I think these sorts of interventions really build that confidence. The laneways here that have been done, like Alley-Oop, for example, one of the things that also it helps with is the change of perception of safety. And, the vast majority of safety is the perception of safety, right? It doesn't mean that you're going to be knifed in the back alley if you walk down the back alley, but there's a sense of fear. And I think that when we begin to shift, even through just a paint or through different types of playful interventions, it sends a very strong signal to the community that these are in fact safe places, and really kind of set the stage for more to happen in them.
Great.
Yeah.
Another one here. Are there studies about the direct benefits to businesses when there is accessible public space nearby?
Yes, from our experience, I would say absolutely. I mean, time and time again, we see that these spaces typically generate more foot traffic than anticipated. You know, sometimes the friction happens where business owners, particularly existing established business owners, maybe who've been depending on clientele for a very long time, that might be coming by car and requiring parking, that sense of loss of parking is you know, understandably, you know, concerning for business owners, right? But you know, the confidence of being able to embrace that change and to look at the statistics and say and realize that this is actually generating more foot traffic and potentially more patrons to businesses, I think has been a real positive thing and a real confidence booster in our city.
Great. Got a few more coming in here. So referencing your mock-ups that you did for Robson Burrard and Granville, are you thinking about how social distancing and live occupancy lines in retail could fit into these pedestrian streets that you mocked up?
I think that we need to recognize that our behaviors have changed. And I think that even so long as a portion of our population is concerned about the importance of social distancing, that must be taken into account. And so I think these are design considerations that are probably here to stay for a while. Yes.
Great. How do you think digital out-of-home technology can play a role in branding and placemaking for Vancouver?
So digital out-of-home technology. So would that be like interactive media, Wi-Fi, that sort of thing? Or
I think so. That's how I would take it. Yeah, digital out-of-home. I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think that definitely fits within a repertoire of cultural programming potentially. Like I would say that the Quartier de Spectacle in Montreal is probably a great example of media and light and, you know, a variety of different seasonal dynamic programming that I think technology could bring to bear in something like this. So I think, yeah, it's also very ephemeral and I think very flexible. So I think if technology can address those types of things that can create more of a 24-hour street catering to a variety of different users, I think it's all very positive and doable. Yeah.
Great. Another couple here. How do we encourage smaller, more maneuverable vehicles such as bikes, scooters, electric pedal bikes, etc., so that we maintain mobility while giving more public space to pedestrians? So how do we encourage those uses?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that, you know, we've seen a lot of, in the last 10 years, all kinds of non-motorized wheel uses or hybrid, are they motorized or not? So the people are coming to these places in all modes. And I think being able to, you know, a lot of our work that we do with shared streets, you know, I'll use Granville Island as a quintessential example of that, where you have this sort of organized chaos of pedestrians combined with vehicles and everyone's slow and everyone's making eye contact and looking at each other. I think it's possible and certainly doable in a lot of these streets. But I do think that we need to provide facilities for, you know, safe bike parking or you know, safe passages for some of these smaller vehicles to move through. And I think it's kind of like the Robson Street example, where you might take that cross section of, you know, 4 lanes, and it might be reduced to 2 or 1 lane that does address smaller vehicles potentially, something of that nature.
Great. Another one here. What level of consultation is typically required for smaller scale placemaking projects, and how much consultation is too much in terms of keeping projects moving quickly?
Yeah, so I think it depends. You know, in a lot of the parklet initiatives that the city has been involved with, there's very little public consultation. It's more consultation with the business owners that are sort of providing the agency for the implementation of these parklets. They're providing a lot of the funding and so forth. So I think there's definitely partnerships between interested parties that would be co-funding this stuff. So I think that the Parklet Initiative is something that, you know, they received council approval many years ago. It's kind of an accepted practice in our city. I think when it comes to other major installations, like I'll use the 800 block as an example, you know, I think there was a lot of back and forth with interest groups, the stakeholders and the public, because this is really a major portion of the city. So I think it really depends on the scale and where those established initiatives are. The Pavement to Plazas initiative is, again, has been endorsed by council, and it's oftentimes partnerships between community business associations. You know, I think that, you know, typically one would be informing the public on some of those elements, but usually public consultation is a good thing, right? Because, you know, it usually, from our experience doing this a lot, it enriches the project. It unlocks maybe certain considerations that may not necessarily have been thought about by those who are actually implementing them. So.
Absolutely. Great. Do you think there are some impacts of COVID-19 that could actually be positive for placemaking in the city, i.e. relaxed city bylaws, less red tape, those kind of things?
Absolutely. You know, you never let a crisis go by without seizing an opportunity. And I think that we've seen municipalities like, I believe the city of North Vancouver, they've relaxed their liquor laws. You recall the slide where they've shut down the on-street parking and they've kind of used those flex spaces. So that was a catalyst for them to relax their municipal liquor laws. You know, the same thing goes for Vancouver as well. I think that, you know, it's really allowed even transportation engineering to rethink major arterials or major streets like Beach Avenue and Davie Street, and kind of reallocating the street to dedicated bikeways and things like that. And so, you know, again, you know, with, you know, because this is going to be with us for probably a year or more, it's an opportunity to recalibrate people's habits. And oftentimes people resist change, but when they see it and it's there for a while, then oftentimes people forget about what was there before, and people just adapt, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Great. What is it? 2:50. We got time for a couple more before we wrap up, just being conscious of everybody's time. Any specific thoughts on how the public realm can help art institutions recover?
Oh, yes. I mean, I think that's art institutions, writers guilds, filmmakers, you know, all those groups are really have been hard hit. And I think that part of that is that, you know, a lot of these art institutions are kind of out of sight, out of mind. You know, you can't go to a movie theater. It's difficult to go to an art gallery. You know, a lot of the funding has been repealed on a lot of these artists right now. And I think that the public domain as this canvas for creative expression could be huge, right? I think about that image of Granville Street during the Olympics, and, you know, that whole corridor as being kind of a place for artful expression is something that I think could really reinvigorate those communities and sort of help them out.
Great. Let's see, on here. How does, in your opinion, how does Vancouver stack up against other cities in the world when it comes to placemaking and public space use? You kind of touched on that in a few of your slides, but.
Yeah, I think we're getting better. I think Vancouver, I think we suffer culturally like most North American cities do. We're a denser city, but I think we still suffer from this still auto-centric mentality in spite of the density that we have in our downtown. And it always amazes me that we still don't have a pedestrian street. You go to Ottawa, that has a fraction of the number of warm days that we have, and they have a pedestrian street. Arguably, whether it's successful or not is another story. Or you go to Helsinki, a Nordic climate where they have pedestrian streets. So I think it's response to culture, and maybe not just culture, but habit. I think it's really what we're used to seeing or doing. And it's human nature that we tend to resist change if we fear that it might adversely affect us. But, I think we need to kind of embrace that. And I think that Vancouver has an incredibly creative population. We're one of the creative class cities of the world. And why can't we be a leader in this? Not only can we follow examples set for us around the world, but why can't we take this and lead in ways that maybe other cities have never even conceived of? I think it's time.
Great. A couple more here I think we can squeeze in. Las Ramblas is also one of my favorite places, but I went there for Gaudi. In that sense, do you think laneway designs need to be supported by culture and art? Can you give a concrete example of how that might play out in Vancouver? Also, would you elaborate a bit on the breadcrumb concept you mentioned in your presentation?
Yeah, so I think that, one of the social constructs of streets is that they are conduits for public life, and public life is culture. And in most instances that you see around the world, not only do they benefit from retailers, in close proximity continuously along the street, but there's usually live performance, there's buskers, there's outdoor public art. It's all those things that make for a very, very much a destination precinct, right? That even if you don't have $1 to spend in a store, you can actually go out and partake in something quite eventful. And I think that's where the public art piece comes in. What was the second part of the question?
They were asking you to elaborate a bit on your breadcrumb concept you talked about.
Yeah. So basically, kind of in our urban design practice, what we notice in terms of human behavior is that people's willingness to walk along the street from end to end is only sustained by the frequency of activities and businesses that line that street that you're walking along. And usually it's, that's why urban planners on high streets and retail streets tend not to favor banks or large expanses of glazing along a grocery store or continuous rows of for lease signs, because the moment you sort of go beyond about 30 feet, your interest begins to drop off, and consequently foot traffic begins to drop off. And so some of the ideas in terms of how to sort of resuscitate streets like Granville Street, for example, where you have like the Cineplex Odeon that's just been a big blank face, or even, a lot of the nightclubs that are only open in the evenings up until now. I know some of them are taken over by restaurants now, which is great, but it just leaves kind of a dearth of inactivity along the street. And so not only is it important to kind of recast those types of who the operators are of those businesses, but also there's an opportunity to take these breadcrumbs, which could be kiosks, retail kiosks, outdoor vendors, in some of the images that I'd shown, and those become the breadcrumbs that lead people along and create that connectivity along the street, right?
Great. Let's do one more here. It's a long one, but we'll do it. How do we ensure the temporary spaces in cities are implementing, that cities are implementing in response to the need for more space during the COVID pandemic are actually instituted in the future? Historical examples of these infrastructural shifts have shown to be temporary unless they are literally, quote, cast in place permanent. Are we doing a disservice by focusing on lightweight/modular initiatives right now? And instead, would it be more tactical to focus on initiatives that ensure longer term, more permanent design solutions?
Yeah, I tend to agree with that we as human beings have very short attention spans, or short memories, I should say. And, it would be a shame for a crisis to pass and we've learned nothing from it. And I think that we need, whenever we're making even a temporary intervention, we should be taking a long view towards this intervention and what this really means for permanent change in the public realm, right? Because I think this is really an opportunity, a striking point for us to say, you know, we're long overdue to move beyond our auto-centric culture into something much more meaningful and aligned with the way that we live in our downtown. And so I think it's that broader view that's incredibly important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it goes back to your last slide and talking about being bold, taking bold action. I think that's really important during this time. So that's great. I think that's all we have time for. I'm going to wrap up so we can finish right at 3. But first off, thank you, Derek, for your presentation, for all your insights and imagery and fantastic designs there. So, and for fielding all of these questions from our membership, greatly appreciated. Thanks everybody for joining us. You'll be receiving a follow-up survey via email this afternoon. So we appreciate hearing from you and hope that you find a few moments to fill it out and let us know how we did today for the webinar. And we also love to hear from you about topics that we can cover in the future webinars. So please let us know in that survey that you'll be receiving. So that's it for today. And I just want to thank everybody and we'll see you next time. And thanks, Derek, again.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye.